Hey everybody, Countdown VHS here, and welcome to another Wainrider Wednesday, where we take a look weekly at the progress of a mod for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion, the original, not the remaster. And in this one, we're taking a look at the faction called the Western Horde. This is one of two Wainrider factions in the mod. The other one is the faction of Great Rune. We'll take a look at them a little bit later. But today I want to jump into the campaign map and talk and look at some of the territory that this faction inhabits. Now, the name the Western Horde, of course, does not appear in any of the writings of Tolkien, but we felt it necessary in the mod to distinguish between what appear to have been two separate, distinct Wainrider factions. If you follow the most comprehensive and detailed account of the Wainrider Wars, which is to be found in Unfinished Tales, in the section titled Cirion and Eorl, you'll find references to what are called Wainriders of Ravanion on one hand, and Eastern Wainriders on the other. The Wainriders of Ravanion seem to correspond to the first wave of Wainriders who advanced into the territory that had been held by Northmen allied to Gondor. That corresponds to essentially the territory you can see here on the minimap. That is from Mirkwood along the Anduin down to the northern slopes of the Ash Mountains at Mordor, and then roughly eastward towards the Sea of Rune, extending up towards perhaps the East Bight. This first group of Wainriders began their invasions in the year 1851, we are told, and 5 years later, in 1856, they fought a great battle against the King of Gondor and his army, Narmakil II, somewhere south of Mirkwood, probably in the Brownlands. In that battle, the King of Gondor himself fell, and his army was routed. Many of the Northmen who had been fighting alongside him fled west and north up into the Vales of the Anduin, where they would later form what became known as the Eotheod. But as for the victors in that battle, known as the Battle of the Plains, they did not press further into Gondor's territory or up in pursuit of those retreating Northmen. It is said in our sources that they were content for the time to complete their conquest of Rovanion. Now, Rovanion can mean many things in the writings of Tolkien. On the one hand, it seems to be a broad term for all the territory roughly east of the Misty Mountains and stretching over towards the Sea of Rune and down to Mordor. However, in the context of the Wainrider Wars, it seems to speak to a more narrow, specific territory. Centuries earlier, there was a Northman ruler named Vidugavia who called himself, we are told, King of Rovanion, and his territory was to have been found somewhere in this area, east of Mirkwood and south of the Kelduin. And this territory and the lands to the south and east of it seem to have been those that would have been most intensely settled by these newly invading Wainriders from the east. These regions, after all, closest to the forest, were the places where we are told the majority of the Northmanish population was settled, and the Wainriders who invaded seem to have taken up the homes, for the most part, of the conquered peoples. And so for that reason, we've decided in the mod to use the Middlemanish settlement models for the settlements of these Wainriders, the Western Horde. We can take a closer look here, and again, this is a good point to remind you of the usual caveats that what you're seeing here is a work in progress, and we have some stuff yet to do, such as moving the resources out of the way of all of the settlements. They're just placed here for convenience sake currently. But looking at this settlement, initially your capital, you can see that it boasts a sort of a rough stockade, some wooden halls in the midst of it, some larger buildings, and overall it certainly has a less developed, less organized look perhaps than the Dúnedainic settlements you would see in Gondor. Again, we imagine these to be the settlements built initially by the Northmen of Rovanion and usurped by the Wainriders as part of their invasion. And of particular interest, at least to me, is this territory up here in what is known as the East Bight. This is the region of Mirkwood that had been created by the felling of trees of the Northmen, we are told, and this seems to have boasted a large amount of their population and was probably the seat of Vidugavia's power about 600 years before the Wainrider invasion. It stands to reason that there would have been a significant Northmanish population here, and that would have been destroyed or enslaved when the Wainriders moved in and set up their own homes. And one other feature of this map that may be useful to point out is that because in this period we hear of traffic through the forest, Mirkwood itself boasts a few more passages than you may remember from Dominion of Men. So moving west from the Great Bight, we can see that this is actually a traversable path leading into the Vales of Anduin, and moving farther to the north towards the Kelduin, we can see a similar route leading through the forest. At various points during the Wainrider invasion and after, we are told that there were raids through the forest, apparently on both sides, both the Wainriders moving through the woods to trouble the Aotheod, and vice versa. So it stands to reason that there will be these paths that you can take. Of course, these places are likely to be prime spots for ambushes, so moving through this territory, it may be wise to scout ahead. Another frontier that will be important for this group of Wainriders is, of course, the river itself, the Anduin. There will be a passage down through the Vales, of course, on the western side of southern Mirkwood, but the river itself is going to boast several crossings, on the other side of which will be found Gondor. Kalinardon at this point, of course, is not settled by Rohan. That would come many centuries in the future. At this point, the plains of Kalinardon are settled by what few men of Gondor remain in the area. Now, in terms of lore, Gondor successfully seems to have defended this line throughout the Wainrider period. There were rumors of raids that were planned on the part of the Wainriders over the Anduin, but those raids, as far as we know, never actually manifested. But of course, if you're playing as the Western Horde, this is going to be a border to watch for, because Gondor, although it is relatively weak in the area initially, may use these crossings to strike back at you, and of course you can use the same to do the reverse. Otherwise, the Western Horde does not begin bordering Gondor, actually. Their western settlement in the Brownlands is the only one that does so. To the south, they have a settlement more or less in the middle of southern Ravanian, I suppose, but it's relatively far from the borders of Ithilien, and so you may have a bit of time to prepare an invasion yourself or to defend your own lands against a counterstroke from Gondor. The Western Horde also has a bit of strategic depth in that they have some territory slightly to the east, near the mountains that you can see on the southwest of the Sea of Rune. But north and east of that point, you'll find still independent rebels, outlaws, most likely remnants of Northmen who have not yet been driven across the river running. These, of course, would make good early targets for expansion. Beyond them, you're liable to find a more powerful coalition of Northmen and their dwarven allies, which we're calling in the mod the League of the North. Initially, this is going to be a pretty small confederation, sort of intended as a call ahead to the much later alliance between the dwarves of Erebor and the men of Dale. Neither of those places have been, officially founded as realms at this point, but we imagine there certainly were dwarves at the Iron Hills, and there certainly were Northmen around the northeastern eaves of the forest. So the point is, as the Western Horde, if you head north, you may encounter some stiffer resistance than you initially expect. South and east of your starting position will be the other Wainrider faction, Great Rune. Now, we plan to set this up so that these factions will be initially allied, and we do have some tricks at our disposal if we want to really secure that alliance. The major goal, of course, is to see these factions fighting against Gondor, but it's not out of the question for them to be quarreling with each other occasionally. We know, for example, that Great Rune had no qualms about making war on its southern borders, but we'll have to see how that diplomatic setup will all shake out. And I also want to point out that the terrain of Rovanion is perhaps something of a departure from what you may have seen in other depictions. Of course, in the actual maps of Middle-earth, we get very few clues about what this territory may have looked like. We know there are open lands, broad plains, and so on, but I don't think we need to interpret all of this territory as one vast steppe. It's easy to see, for example, that certain parts of the map were given a lot more detail because those were directly relevant to the stories that Tolkien was telling about the War of the Ring. Lack of detail in other parts of the map does not mean lack of features. So, for example, there certainly could have been forests, hills, even small mountain ranges, streams, things of that nature that didn't directly bear on the events. And so long as these terrain features do not have an outsized impact on the flow of armies and the progression of events in general, I think it's fair to add them where it seems reasonable to do so. So while we've tried to preserve the more open territory east of Mirkwood, certainly south in the Brownlands, you will see some more forested territory, some more hills and things. in this imagination of Rovanion. And as you can see here, I've advanced a turn into winter, and this all gets a bit of snow cover in that season. Certainly a little bit heavier, as you can tell, in the north, a little lighter snow and frost cover to the south, and then as you approach Mordor and enter Ithilien, the snows essentially cease. We know that there would have been snows at least part of the time, part of the winter, because there's reference in Unfinished Tales to the Year of the Plague, which saw some heavy snows in Rovanion, or at least in this part of Rovanion east of Mirkwood, and the Northmen were driven inside their long wooden houses. Now, one other thing I can show you is the development of the settlement tiers, because of course each of them has a slightly different, more advanced model. So let's take a look at this settlement here in the Brownlands, as it doesn't have too many resources around it. That pink squarish thing is, I believe, clay, but at any rate, just sort of ignore that. Here we've got a fairly low tier settlement. Here we've got that same settlement with a wooden palisade. Here a slightly more advanced stockade style wall. And here at the highest level of development with that high timber wall, you can see the settlement has grown, starting to expand outward even beyond the borders of the wall itself. Now again, this is the settlement model that is also going to be used for middlemen factions, such as the Eotheod, the Chiefdom of the Angren, the Black Forest tribes, and so on. But as I've said, the Western Horde moving into Rovanion and swiftly moving into the homes of the subjugated Northmen seems to have taken up a somewhat more sedentary existence after their successful invasion in the mid-1800s. And this difference in settlement style is only one of the differences between the Western Horde and Great Rune. We'll look at that faction in a later video, but in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this look at Rovanion, the starting point of the Western Horde. Stay tuned for future Wainrider updates on Wednesdays, and as always, take care.